Lawmaking influences in Australia is quite a good syllabus dot point in that what you'll find is that many of the examples that I'm going to go through today are examples that you have looked at already in previous syllabus dot points. These include things like the first syllabus point around legislative, executive and judicial powers, functions of Parliament, role and powers of the High Court, and you'll also find the contemporary issues link in quite well. So hopefully the ability for you to look at a number of different cases in terms of the courts. You're not going to be learning any new cases, and in this respect, we'll actually be reducing your load, I suppose. In terms of the relevant examples, King talked about the Religious Discrimination Bill, and what you'll find is that the Religious Discrimination Bill has lots that we can apply it to in terms of lawmaking. So in relation to political parties, the major parties in terms of the Liberal Party and the ALP, they both had a significant influence. Liberal Party, we know, wasn't able to get that bill across the line. A lot of that was due to internal opposition in their party, whereas the ALP, their opposition was going to play out in the Senate. So that the Liberal Party knew would force them to retract the bill. In terms of minor parties, it was actually the Centre Alliance had quite a bit of influence here, and it was those amendments that were moved by Rebecca Sharkey that actually, I suppose, were the beginning of the end of that Religious Discrimination Bill. In terms of individuals and pressure groups, individuals can have quite a significant influence in lawmaking in Parliament when they submit to committees for that committee stage of the lawmaking process. So we've got a few people here. Professor George Williams is someone who's quite a prominent advocate, and he had a written submission to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. And when we look at pressure groups, Law Council of Australia also gave some evidence to that Parliamentary Joint Committee. So sometimes you might find that pressure groups and individuals are both able to influence or try to exert an influence using similar methods, particularly in that committee stage. In terms of the influence of individuals, political parties and pressure groups to lawmaking, it's useful to look at them in terms of their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities for influence and threats to their ability to influence. So in terms of individuals, some of the strengths of their influence is how it can work to uphold democracy. So what we find here is that in terms of individuals, we vote in members to represent us in Parliament. So when they influence lawmaking, they are hopefully fulfilling their representative function when they are acting as the voice of citizens in Parliament. It's going to be interesting to look at this in terms of the independent movement, the Teal independence after the election on the 21st of May, and whether we see any further, I suppose, particularly in terms of things like climate or the any of the other bills and policies that they're running on, corruption commissions, whether any of that gets up and whether that can be attributed to the influence of individuals, these independents, because that was a key policy platform. In terms of individuals in the courts, one of the biggest strengths there, and I suppose an opportunity, is that when an individual has that influence in a constitutional case, it can't be abrogated by Parliament. Some of the weaknesses, if you are going to court those, that we know it's expensive and you need standing. So it's not always easy for an individual who seeks to influence the law to do that through the courts unless they have a legitimate reason to do so and the money. In Parliament, we know that individuals in general have a huge issue, or not issue, they have a trouble trying to get their policies through, particularly if they're an independent in the House of Reps. Just look at Haylie Pepper. She has been trying to get bills through on climate inaction and corruption, but so far has been unable to enact anything because she lacks the majority support in the House of Reps, and her policies are very much the antithesis to the government's policy agenda. We do see independents in general having more of an impact in the Senate. However, we only have one true independent at the moment, and that is Rex Patrick. But keep an eye on how he's running in the 2022 election, because he is possibly running for his own political party. I'm not quite sure on that one, but that's what you often find, is that some independents, Jackie Lambie, for instance, is technically from the Jackie Lambie network. She will be another interesting one to look at in terms of political parties, and whether she's able to get one more senator elected from Tasmania. Individuals also have, in terms of opportunities to influence lawmaking by creating new precedent, which can then maybe cause Parliament, depending if it's I suppose a common law precedent, and an example is something like Mabo, resulting in the creation of new law. So, for example, the Native Title Act as a result of Mabo in 1992. Or in the case of the Wick case, what we saw then was the Native Title Amendment Act of 1998. In terms of Parliament, individuals, opportunities can arise, but mostly in terms of if there's a minority government. And we saw this with Karen Phelps and her influence in relation to the Senate amendments to the Home Affairs legislation that resulted in Medivac in February 2019. One of the biggest threats to individuals in their ability to influence lawmaking is their ability to get to the High Court. Only 13% of cases are successful in their applications for special leave. In terms of Parliament, we know that the government overwhelmingly dominates the legislative agenda. So if you're an independent, you're going to have a greater influence in your ability to perhaps negotiate for amendments to legislation rather than initiating your own legislation. No private members' bills were passed in our last Parliament, the 46th Parliament, which we are just about coming to the end of. And in the 45th Parliament, we had one private members' bill, and that was Senator Dean Smith's amendment to the Marriage Act. So here, there's a couple of examples here in terms of Mabo and Wick. Also, Dylan Voller is an interesting one to look at, and the influence that he has had in terms of defamation and the responsibility that media companies have when individuals are commenting on their posts, on news that they have posted on their social media sites. Love and Tom's had significant influence in terms of that definition of the alien's power, and also Clubb and Edwards, Preston and Avery in terms of limits to the freedom of political communication, and Michaela Banerjee there as well. In particular, Love and Tom's is a really good one to look at, and Clubb and Edwards and Preston and Avery, because they also can count as contemporary issues relating to legal power. So you're able to cover off on a few things there. When looking at individuals and lawmaking in Parliament, it's good to look, or one way of classifying it to provide for analysis in an essay might be to look at the difference between internal and external influences. So internal being members of Parliament, and looking at that in terms of how have they been successful. So, for example, independents during the minority government, or private members' bills, but it's always good to have that however statement. In what way aren't they very successful? And Haylie Pepper, for example, with the climate change bill is a good example there. External, so individual lobbying, we'll look at Maeve's Law in a moment. Someone like Rosie Batty has been very influential in relation to domestic violence legislation, and someone like Anthony Green and the 2016 voting reforms, he provided contribution to a committee on that. Maeve's Law is a really new bill that has been passed recently in our federal parliament in relation to mitochondrial donation. And so I've included an aspect of the second reading speech there from Greg Hunt, who is the outgoing Minister for Health. And that bit in bold there just signalling that this law would not have come about but for the individual lobbying of Maeve Hood and her family raising awareness around mitochondrial disease and the need for this legislation. And of course, that Medivac repeal was criticised by many. In terms of political parties can have significant strengths in terms of if you are the government, you are able to represent the will of the majority. Sorry, my lights have just gone off. There we go. Needed to move again. Whoever is the major party is going to be able to dominate the legislative agenda, but that's quite a democratic thing given that they represent the will of the majority. However, and this is where we bring in our understanding of mandates, we also know that the government generally doesn't get a majority in the Senate. Does that reflect the will of the people to have minor parties or the opposition negotiating with the government to change some of their bills? In terms of weaknesses, we could probably argue both a tyranny of the majority and a tyranny of the minority. Sorry, my phone is ringing, but I'll just ignore that. So tyranny of the majority, all right, means that the government is exerting a disproportionate influence. And we can see that in terms of the government. We had no private members' bills being successful in the last parliament. Tyranny of the minority, we can see that in terms of when people like Jackie Lambie from the Jackie Lambie Network, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Centre Alliance are able to negotiate on bills that allow them to negotiate just for their own state's benefit. So, for example, Centre Alliance and university funding reform just for South Australia, Jackie Lambie Network and the state housing debt relief just for Tasmania in exchange for her support on the 2019 tax cuts. She is able to make or break a bill based on whether she's getting something for a very small proportion of the population. So you could argue that's problematic. But she has also been voted into our Senate, and each state has equal representation. So lots to kind of pull apart there in terms of your analysis. There are many opportunities for political parties to exert influence, and they'll be most successful if you're a minor party, if you're part of a coalition or a minority government, if you're in the Senate and you hold the balance of power. And we can also see, particularly in relation to the religious discrimination bill, minor parties in the opposition were able to capitalise on the internal government conflict to force that religious discrimination bill to be put to the side until there was time to go into that in further detail. Threats to the ability of political parties to influence lawmaking. We know that a hostile Senate can stymie government legislation, e.g. the religious discrimination bill. Also, if there is a minority government in the House of Representatives, it can threaten the ability of the government to pass legislation at all, or it can mean that legislation like the Medivac bill is passed that undermines the government's legislative agenda. And what we also might see is if there are like-minded minor parties in the Senate with the balance of power, they, for example, One Nation and Jackie Lambie Network and Centre Alliance are probably a few that often provide support to the Morrison government. One Nation in particular has provided more support than any of those other minor parties to the Morrison government. And so, of course, we've got this representation of the religious discrimination bill. Another way that you can analyse this influence is looking at whether a political party, and this can be applied in terms of individuals and pressure groups, whether they're significant/effective or lack power and are ineffective. In a politics essay or any response, that requires some analysis, so a part C in a short answer, or a part C or D in a source analysis, what you're needing to do is often tease apart an issue in terms of 2 or 3 things. And this can provide a nice way for you to balance or evaluate. So we can see that minor parties had significant influence in the Medivac amendments. However, they also had some significant influence in terms of the Medivac repeal. They also, you could argue, had a significant impact in terms of that religious discrimination bill, Rebecca Sharkey from the Centre Alliance in particular. In terms of that higher education support amendment, people like the Jackie Lambie from the Jackie Lambie Network were really critical of the university funding, that university funding bill in 2020 that was most prominent for making humanities degrees more expensive. But Central Alliance negotiated successfully and said, we'll give you those 2 votes if you give South Australia greater funding. So Central Alliance probably had power in that respect, but other minor parties did not. And of course, that climate emergency declaration bill from the Greens didn't go anywhere fast. Political parties in the courts, there isn't too much case law on this. So the Communist Party case is one that gets discussed a lot, and it's still a really good one to reflect on. And also Day and the Electoral Commissioner is a good case to look at in terms of Bob Day tried to initiate a case to state that those Senate voting reforms were undemocratic, but he was unsuccessful. And this cartoon, I think, encapsulates the influence of minor parties like the Nationals over climate policy of the current Liberal government. Finally, pressure groups. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, pressure groups provide a really strong democratic link because anyone can participate. You don't have to be a citizen, and you don't have to meet a minimum age requirement like you do if you are wanting to run for Parliament, for instance. And they can, in terms of the courts, allow a check on by the judiciary on actions of the legislative or the executive. So in this case, that's the Student Strike for Climate Change group, the Minister for the Environment and Sharma. In terms of weaknesses, pressure groups lack an ability to be directly involved in that lawmaking process, so they are going to potentially be less effective than, say, a political party. But we know that they have significant opportunities in terms of lobbying, especially if they are more closely linked with political parties. I'm thinking about the ACTU and the Labor Party and their ability to influence the JobKeeper legislation. They can often make submissions to Parliament, like the Law Council of Australia did on the religious discrimination bill. In terms of their threats, probably one of the biggest threats would be that some pressure groups, if you reflect on how many people are part of that group in comparison to the rest of the population, but the influence they have, if they have very close ties to Parliament, that can be really, really problematic. And finally, it's always important to look at previous WACE essays. So a really good question in 2018 here to look at in terms of lawmaking. Always important when you've got a lawmaking essay to check whether it's referring to Parliament or the courts, or Parliament and the courts. It might ask you to specify only one aspect. So if it was to specify just Parliament, then anything you wrote on the courts would not be relevant. Also, it usually will specify particular aspects. So here it's individuals and pressure groups. So there's no need to just try to discuss political parties in there as well. Use those WACE answer guides to help guide your response, but look at them after you've had a go at it yourself. And this is a really good way that I get my students to plan essay responses when we're doing practices in class. So that definitions column is where you put, essentially you plan your introduction and also add in any key terms that need to be defined. It doesn't need to be every key term that needs to be defined because you don't want your introduction to read like a shopping list. of definitions, and then we've got the rest of the paragraphs there, and you can see those however statements are there to make sure that each paragraph is providing some evaluation. I hope that has been useful.